Hi, English composition students. I wanted to do a few quick videos on narration and description and diction since this is the last essay that you're working on. You may have already perused these materials, but I wanted to just talk through them a little bit more. This last assignment, this last essay that you're doing is actually one of my favorites, partially because I like to get away from the research and I like to be able to be more creative and watch my students be more creative. If you go to movies, watch movies, do Netflix, if you watch previews of those, you'll see quickly the summation of what's going on in them. In the PowerPoint that I have on Blackboard, I have a link to Shawshank Redemption, which is a movie that came out in the 90s and starred Morgan Freeman and Tim, can't think of his last name. It's the story of a man possibly falsely convicted of murdering his wife and her lover. And when you watch a 2.5-minute preview for a movie or a trailer, you get the characters, you get the plot, and you get often the setting and the time. So those are all components of telling a story. And stories come in all forms. They come in poems, they come in short stories, in novels, in Netflix series, in movies, in drama that unfolds on social media. So we are immersed in it. And we as people love stories. We have been telling stories and sharing stories since the time that we could begin talking. And it's a way that we can bond and commune and learn from each other and travel different places and meet different people. It's one of the reasons why I love to read. I love to meet new characters and go places I might never go, learn about how people cope with conflict, and maybe hopefully, if I am ever faced with that same conflict, know how to approach it in a way that is healthy. Think of yourself as you're telling your story as a journalist or as a filmmaker. Who's in the story? What is happening to them? When did it take place? How long of a time are you covering? Considering you only have 2.5 to 4 pages, you might need to cut down and focus on the most important bits. It's not a lot of pages to give you a full flesh story like you might see in a movie. So take the most important part. One of the key things in storytelling is that you as the author get to determine the important details to leave in and take out, and you get to be creative with it. So oftentimes when we select stories to tell and to write about, we are drawing from personal experience. I know that when I am asked to write a story, it's usually coming from something that I have had happen to me or happen to someone I know. But that doesn't mean that you can't embellish. You can tell a completely fictional story, something that has come from your brain that is creative and has never happened. That's where we get science fiction. But you can also tell a story that's happened, but augment or tweak the details. We probably aren't going to know anyway, and if it makes for a better story in your writing, that is something that you are free to do. However, if you're not comfortable doing that, you don't have to either. Stay true to actually what happened. When you tell a story, you are talking about what happens. And for it to be a compelling story, there has to be an amount of conflict that happens. There has to be somebody overcoming something. So it can't just be description. It can't just be walking through a meadow and listening to the birds and I see the bluffs and hear the fish. It has to have some kind of conflict in it for it to be a compelling story. So the plot tells us what happens. And again, if we go back to those previews or trailers of movies, we get a little snippet of what's happening that makes us want to go to the movie theater or rent the film. When you are talking about plot, you're talking about background. So oftentimes when we start a novel or we start a series or we start a movie, we don't get a lot of background right away. We get plopped into the middle of the conflict, and then we get more details about the character later, which is a fine way to start a story. As I mentioned, there has to be conflict, and then there has to be some kind of resolution to that conflict. It might not be a satisfactory resolution. Think about films or series that you've watched that they've ended and you've gone, huh? That was not satisfying. Sometimes that's life. So you get to determine when and how you solve that conflict. The background is characters, who they are, how they talk, how they look, how they interact. Again, you don't have a lot of pages to cover this, but we might want to be able to quickly see who you're talking about. And then conflict can involve one of three things or all of those things. So a person versus person, this can be a physical altercation or it can be a verbal altercation with somebody. Person versus nature, so if you're stuck in a snowstorm or a thunderstorm or a hurricane is coming, that would be an example of that. And then person versus self, which is a very common one that we see, especially in films and series. So you have some kind of internal conflict. I don't know whether to stay with or break up with a partner. Should I move across the country? Should I go to this college or that college? So it's a conflict that you have to resolve within yourself. And a story can have all three of these. Shawshank Redemption, if you haven't seen it, it's a fantastic movie. It does have all three of these, but it's a 2-hour movie and it has the space to do that. So think about what your conflict is going to be. You will, as you tell your story, the tension will rise and it builds. It's the moment in the movie theater when you don't want to go to the bathroom because something is happening. And that moment where that resolution is going to be resolved is the moment of climax. So it is the most suspenseful, most emotional part of the movie. I have a clip here of the character in Shawshank Redemption holding a rock, and he is straddling a drainage pipe, and he's waiting for a clap of thunder to camouflage the noise of the rock hitting that pipe. And it's a pivotal moment because we don't know if he's going to make it or not. Resolution is the last part of the story. It's how you tie everything together. Is it a happy ending? Is it a sad ending? Is it a kind of a cliffhanger? We need, as readers, to have some feeling that there's an end to it. So even if it's not something that ended the way you wanted it to, there is an end to it. I believe, I'll have to double check, but on Blackboard, there's a student who wrote a story about raising a goose. She found a gosling when it was young and raised it. And the gosling doesn't make it. And the story did not end how I wanted it to end, but there was an ending to the story. And as readers, we crave that feeling of resolution. So it should follow what's happening in the story. It shouldn't deviate and go in a completely different direction. When you start your story, again, consider how you can just plop us in. You might not need to do a lot of background if we are just immediately dropped into the conflict. That's usually a pretty good way to pull us in, and then you can give us some character details later. Think about the point of view. Is this my story? So I'm using I, me, my, our, we pronouns. Is this your story? He, she, they, them. Rarely, if ever, do we use second person pronouns or you and your when writing a story. So I want you to be aware of not using those pronouns in your story unless you're using dialogue to talk to each other. But it's very awkward to read a story that uses you and your because it places you as the reader in the shoes of that person, and maybe you haven't experienced that. So I, me, my is going to be more personal. He, she, they, them is going to be more distant. A lot of novels use third-person point of view. A lot of them also use first-person point of view. So as you begin to develop your characters, again, whether they're real or fictional, think about how an outsider would see them, how they look, how they talk, how they walk, how they smell. I almost always go back to trying to describe my grandmother when I do this exercise because she had really prominent cheekbones and poofy 1940s hair, and she always wore pearls and polyester pants, and she had a humpback because she had scoliosis, and she had a distinct set of teeth, and she wore plastic glasses that didn't fit very well. So I would try to incorporate some of those character cues when writing about her. So think about how an outsider would view the people that you're writing about. You might be writing about people that you know very well, but how do outsiders see them? Sometimes when we're so close to the topic that we're writing about, we take for granted that our readers are going to see the same things that we do, which is not always the case. Setting is where the action takes place. So the time period, the season, is it outside, is it inside? How much time are we elapsing? And if you are covering a pretty good chunk of time, you need to use the transitions that help your reader follow along with that. So 6 months later, or 2 years after that, or the next day, use those kind of time transitions. And then you can also use dialogue. You can feel free to have your characters talk to each other. Sometimes we learn more about people as they talk to each other than we do writing about them just sitting there. So think about how you can actually incorporate some dialogue into your story. So I've given you some examples of effective dialogue, and you want to be true to the characters. One of my pet peeves in writing is sappy, overly saccharine dialogue that makes people sound like romance novel characters, and most people don't talk that way. So you have an example of "You're so sweet." Just try to be authentic to who you're writing about. Think about the people that you have in your lives, that how they talk, and what makes them unique and what makes their voices distinct. So those are some examples of how to write a story or a narrative. This last essay that you're doing is a combination between narrative and description. So I'm asking you to write a story that has characters and a conflict, but I'm asking you to be descriptive in it. So using similes and metaphors and figures of speech to help put us in the story. So that's a little bit about narrative. I'm going to do one on description coming up. Thanks.